Okay, hi everybody. How's it going? Cool, this is exciting, this is awesome. I love coding meetups, coding and community, perfect. So, hello. My name's Lara Schenck, L-A-R-A, Lara, very important. Twitter handle, obligatory. And like in my wonderful intro, I'm a WordPress and front-end developer. CSS has really become like my specialty over the last year or so. And I also love teaching, so I love kind of sharing what I know, especially at meetups and environments like this. So I kind of started out my career as a web developer. I'm self-taught, I have an art background, and CSS and HTML were languages that I immediately took to quickly because you can kind of see visual results really quickly. And then about, I guess almost a year, well, last December or so, I ended up getting this whiteboarding interview at one of the big tech companies. And I was like, oh shit, like I gotta learn computer science. Like I have to do these algorithms interviews, like merge sort, bubble sort, all this stuff that I mean, probably wouldn't do bubble sort in the interview. But there were all these concepts that I didn't necessarily encounter as a self-taught front-end developer. And so I kind of set out on this mission to bridge the gap between CSS and computer science. And so I was like, okay, I'm writing code when I write CSS, and I love all this computer science stuff, and it's code. Like, there has to be some overlap here. Why are these two things so separate in my mind? So I started out my research with the question, is CSS a programming language? And I'll follow that up with a little fire emoji, because this is kind of a hot topic. There's this, like, I think really fascinating bias and like phenomenon, especially in the front-end community now, where it's like kind of like crapping on CSS a little bit as like, oh, not a real language, or it's like a faulted language. And so I was like, what's going on here? Like, what is going on? So I asked this question on Twitter, and the responses were varied. 42% said yes, CSS is a programming language. 50% said no, and 8% said I'm not sure. So I was like, okay, let's stop for a second and think about what is a programming language. How many of you have thought about this before? Like, what constitutes a programming language? Okay, a few people. There's a whole like topic of study about this, like programming language theory, that I find very fascinating. And CSS absolutely fits into that. Any code you write fits into that, because the definition for a programming language is a language of instructions for a computer. And this is an incredibly vague definition because there are many, many types of programming languages. And this is, of course, paraphrased from Wikipedia and others. But I was really unable to find a definition that singled out a certain type of language or made something like CSS not a programming language. So there are two kind of umbrella programming paradigms when it comes to languages. So you have imperative languages that instruct a computer how to do things, and you have declarative languages that instruct a computer what to do. And these programming paradigms are kind of models for writing programs in general. They're not specific characteristics per se, but you can divide languages into these two categories. And imperative, the defining quality is control flow. So you can control the execution of statements in a program. And declarative is no control flow. So that logic is baked into the commands. Imperative languages are what you usually think of for programming languages. So JavaScript, Ruby, C++, Python. Declarative languages are oftentimes domain-specific languages, so they're built to function within certain domains. SQL is a domain-specific declarative programming language for databases. HTML, sure, is absolutely a domain-specific language. And CSS is a domain-specific declarative programming language. So, also, talking about CSS and HTML, they are Turing-complete when put together. So Turing-complete is a level of complexity of problems that a language can solve. CSS can do math. There are functions and variables. And ultimately, it's like, why not? Like, why can't CSS be a programming language? What is so different, or what is this like bias towards imperative programming that seems to exist? So, CSS is a declarative, domain-specific declarative programming language. A little bit of a mouthful, 100%. So what do CSS developers program, though? So CSS developers program the layout of web pages. So I'll underline program there, because it's like, what is programming? Writing instructions for a computer, absolutely. But when it comes down to it, we're kind of programming boxes. So who's familiar with the box model in CSS? Okay, so the idea is that every element is ultimately a box when it gets to the browser. And those boxes ultimately turn into images. So it's kind of like, oh, CSS developers program the layout of images, kind of. So I'll give that 100% too. And I want to like try to do a little discussion of the internals of a browser in like 2 minutes. So this is a wonderful person sitting at a computer, of course, and there's a server waiting at the beckoning call. So what do? As we're on a computer, we're like, okay, give me data. The server's like, here is data. So we have a client and a server, and then that HTTP requests data from a server, and the server returns a byte stream. So it returns HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in the form of bytes, so hexadecimal bytes. And once you get to a browser, the browser takes those bytes of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and parses them and tokenizes them. So they're first turned from these hexadecimal bytes into Unicode characters that are called these code units. That's a standard for each browser. And then those are turned into lots of different trees. Well, 3 trees. So we have the DOM and the CSS DOM, and those are the parsed versions of what HTML, CSS, and JavaScript can create. And then those both are turned into or rather not turned into, but a separate tree is constructed from the information in those 2. So the render tree or the rule tree is ultimately what we're kind of programming as when you write CSS. And that then goes to the layout phase. So this is where all these boxes are constructed. And the render tree contains rules attached to each individual node that kind of like layout instructions. And then layout is this like incredible recursive algorithm that goes through and paints, or not paints, but lays out everything onto the page, all the boxes. And then we paint those boxes and ultimately composite them. So writing CSS is a domain-specific language for this process. And so if we had a little flexbox algorithm might be in there, mixed blend modes might come in there, but the whole process here is CSS. And that's kind of the distinction between declarative and imperative. So declarative is really the top of the iceberg here, so that's what we see, the CSS that we see. And then what powers the CSS is this incredible like work of software engineering that is the browser, so C++ and Rust. And I've taken it upon myself to really like peek beneath the curtain of what's going on with CSS, and it's pretty cool. So if we take something like display flex here, so flexbox, this is essentially harnessing thousands of lines of Rust or C++ code, so whatever's inside that rendering engine in the browser. And it's really cool to look through this stuff, especially if you have a little bit of a background or the skills that I've kind of gathered when studying for this whiteboarding interview. It's really fun to look at what powers CSS, and I hope to encourage more people to do this. So declarative CSS, heart. So the fact that we don't have to write a flex algorithm whenever I want to lay things out in a row is very incredible, and the power of declarative programming. So this is a little snippet of code from the source of Firefox, which is called Servo, is the rendering engine in Firefox that was recently rewritten in Rust. And it's all open source, so you can go onto Servo's GitHub and kind of browse through the source code and figure out where these different algorithms are implemented. Imperative Rust, Firefox. So where do you see that? So you can look on the GitHub, and then there's also searchfox.org, which is a searchable repository for Servo or for Firefox. And then Chromium has an open source implementation of Blink, which is the rendering engine in WebKit. And my process for kind of going back and forth between these was to read a spec very closely. So in CSS and HTML and JavaScript, all these open languages, there are specifications for browsers implementing these languages. So I would kind of pick out some spec and be like, oh, let me see if I can find this implemented in the browser. And it gave me this whole appreciation for CSS again, because at the time I was getting a little bored with it, and then I started learning about all this, and I'm like, oh my God, CSS is amazing. I just want to do this all day, because it's like the dream that I don't have to write all these things. So declarative for the win here. And I want to finish kind of with my little conclusion for all this research was like, oh, bridging the gap between CSS and computer science, so nice. Did I bridge the gap? Well, it's more like this. So there's kind of computer science, and then within computer science is CSS, C++, HTML, JavaScript, everything is under this umbrella. So computer science, the topic, is incredibly broad. And the more we can diversify what we call a programming language and what we consider part of computer science, I think the more that can lend to other areas in the field. So I want to just close with a mention of this talk by someone named Phil Yan, who's a Dutch researcher. and she has this talk called "What is Programming Anyway?" And I was watching this and I was like, oh my god, like hell yes, this is so right on. So she talks about how a while back she did a project where she was doing research about domain-specific languages, and she realized she kind of set out on this mission to write a domain-specific language for finance. And then she realized, like, no, they don't need a domain-specific language. Like, people are programming, they're writing code, like they're using spreadsheets and they're writing programs themselves. And so she presented this to the community, like the tech community, and people were like, that's not real programming, though. Like, no. And it's like, what is wrong? Like, what's going on with our community that people are like, hey, I'm really excited about this thing, like this could be programming, and everybody's like, it's not real programming. Like, what? What's going on? So she's so great in her talk. I really recommend watching it. But then she went on to talk about working with children and how when we draw this parallel between programming and math and logic and engineering, what we're really doing is we're assigning these metaphors to what programming is, because although we call it engineering, it's very different to like engineer software than it is to engineer a bridge. And that's what traditionally engineering is. So when we say engineering, we're really assigning a metaphor to what programming is. And so in her talk, she talks about how this is really exclusionary, can really exclude people who are like, oh, math, like me, I was an art major. I was like, math, like no thank you, no math, no logic, I'm good. But there's so much more to programming than these maths and sciences. So her thought is we could call programming writing. So there's another metaphor for how we write programs, because we're ultimately taking kind of disparate pieces and then forming them into ideas. So I highly recommend watching that talk. And she had these same like fun hand-drawn slides as me, and I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. So anyways, I like drawing these little monsters too. So thank you all very much. And at this URL, so this is kind of an abridged version of a longer talk that I did for a CSS conf. And at this URL, there's a ton of resources and things about learning about computer science and kind of browser mechanics. So recommend checking that out if you're interested. Thank you. Wait, I don't need to do this.
So we're going to do a quick Q&A.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody have any questions for Lara?
So I wanted to hear this algorithms talk in the near future.
Oh, yeah.
Where should I go?
It's on YouTube now. If you just look up, well, probably if you look up Lara algorithms, it would come up. But it's called the algorithms of CSS. And so some of the same topics here, but CSS is so cool, everyone, just saying. But like writing, when you can, like we write our own algorithms in CSS too, like declarative algorithms that are kind of these really elegant combinations of styles, and but on YouTube. So if you look up algorithms of CSS.
Is this on JSLA?
Oh yeah, oh my gosh, thank you for reminding me. So I'm also talking at JSLA this week on Thursday. That's going to be kind of the second version of the algorithms of CSS talks, a little longer. Some of the same stuff here, but getting more into writing algorithms and what the algorithms in the browser look like. So thank you for that. Any other questions? Cool.